Chapter 1. At the supermarket. It was supposed to be a quick trip to the supermarket, a routine Saturday morning errand. Deborah navigated the aisles with her list in hand, scanning for deals and trying to stay ahead of the weekend rush. Her life, while not particularly exciting, was comfortable. A steady rhythm governed her days. Work, home, family, and the occasional outing. She was content, or so she thought. As she turned into the fruit section, her eyes fell on a familiar figure. Rodney, her husband of 12 years, stood a few feet away, his back to her. At first, she smiled, thinking how coincidental it was to see him here, as he rarely accompanied her on errands. But her smile froze when she noticed the woman standing next to him. She was tall, with long dark hair, casually dressed but striking in her demeanor. More striking still was the small girl holding Rodney's hand. A girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. Deborah stopped mid-step, her mind scrambling to process the scene. Rodney bent down to pick up an apple, and the little girl tugged at his sleeve, calling out, "Daddy, I want that one." Rodney laughed, his voice warm and affectionate, before handing her the apple. The world around Deborah seemed to blur. That single word, "Daddy," echoed in her ears. Her heart pounded as she watched her husband interact with this woman and child as though they were his family. Every instinct told her to walk away, to convince herself that this was some terrible misunderstanding. But her legs refused to move. Instead, she observed. She noticed how comfortable they seemed together, how Rodney leaned close to the woman, whispering something that made her laugh softly, how he held the little girl's hand with a natural ease that Deborah had only ever seen him show their own children. It was a familiarity that spoke of something far deeper than a casual relationship. Deborah's chest tightened, her breathing shallow as she stepped back into the aisle. Her hands trembled as she clutched her shopping cart, trying to steady herself. The hum of the supermarket faded into the background, replaced by a flood of memories. Moments that now felt tainted, reframed by the sight of her husband with this other family. For the first time in years, Deborah felt her world shift beneath her feet. What had seemed like a solid foundation now felt like a fragile facade, ready to crumble under the weight of secrets she hadn't known existed. She didn't confront him, not here, not now. Instead, she turned her cart and left the store, her thoughts racing and her heart breaking. Her mind replayed the scene on a loop as she drove home. Questions swirled. Who was this woman? How long had this been going on? And most hauntingly, why had she never suspected? She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her vision blurred with tears she couldn't yet allow herself to shed. Deborah knew that the answers to these questions would change everything, and yet, she couldn't shake the fear that she might already know them. Chapter 2. A puzzle of suspicion. Back at home, Deborah sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at a steaming cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. The image of Rodney laughing with the little girl, holding the woman's hand, replayed endlessly in her mind. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen, clinging to a shred of hope that there might be an innocent explanation. But deep down, the doubts that had quietly nagged at her for years began to grow louder. Rodney's behavior had shifted subtly over time, but never in a way that screamed betrayal. He worked long hours, often traveling for business. Late meetings and unexpected deadlines had become a common refrain, one she had never questioned. Why would she? He had always been a good husband, dependable, caring, a doting father to their 2 children. Yet, now that Deborah revisited those moments, they felt different. She remembered the times when Rodney would come home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't hers. He always had a quick explanation, a hug from a colleague, a brush with someone in the office. And she believed him, never probing further. There were the phone calls, too. Rodney had taken to answering his phone in another room, saying it was work-related. Sometimes, he'd step outside entirely. Deborah hadn't thought much of it at the time, chalking it up to his need for privacy with work matters. But now, those memories felt sinister, like tiny breadcrumbs leading to the revelation she had stumbled upon in the supermarket. Then there were the business trips. Rodney had started traveling more frequently about 2 years ago. The trips weren't overly long, 2 or 3 days at most, but their frequency had increased steadily. He would often come home exhausted, With vague stories about back-to-back meetings and tough negotiations, Deborah had always sympathized, even encouraged him to rest after such grueling schedules. But now, she couldn't shake the suspicion that those trips had less to do with business and more to do with them. Deborah's mind jumped to other small but disquieting details. A receipt she had found in his jacket pocket months ago, from a restaurant they had never visited together. She'd asked him about it, and he'd laughed it off, saying it was from a client dinner. Then there were the photos on his phone. Selfies of Rodney smiling against unfamiliar backdrops, places he claimed to have visited during work trips. She'd never thought to question why there were no colleagues in those photos. Each memory added to the growing mosaic of doubt in Deborah's mind. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how skilled Rodney had been at deflecting her questions and masking his actions. The Rodney she saw at the supermarket wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had been living a parallel life right under her nose. Deborah felt a surge of anger at herself for not noticing sooner. Had she been too trusting? Too complacent in their marriage? Her stomach churned as she considered the possibility that her husband had been lying to her for years, while she had unknowingly accepted his excuses and half-truths. She knew she couldn't let this rest. The image of Rodney with the other woman and child haunted her, and the nagging questions demanded answers. For now, she resolved to watch more closely, to pay attention to the details she had overlooked for too long. Her world had begun to crack, but Deborah wasn't ready to confront Rodney. Not yet. She needed more than suspicions. She needed proof. Chapter 3. Phone Secrets. The opportunity came sooner than Deborah expected. On a rainy Wednesday evening, Rodney left his phone charging on the kitchen counter as he stepped out to run a quick errand. Deborah sat in the living room, her pulse quickening as she eyed the device. It was rare for him to leave his phone behind. He was almost obsessive about keeping it with him, claiming it was for work emergencies. For a moment, she hesitated. Invading his privacy felt like a step she couldn't undo. But the image of him at the supermarket, laughing with the little girl and holding the woman's hand, was burned into her mind. Deborah told herself she wasn't being irrational. She deserved to know the truth. She approached the phone cautiously, her hands trembling as she unlocked it. The passcode was no secret. She had seen him enter it countless times. The screen lit up, and her heart sank as she navigated to his messages. At first, there was nothing unusual. Work threads, group chats with friends, messages from their children. But then she found a thread labeled them. The messages started innocently enough. Casual greetings, updates on day-to-day activities. But as she scrolled further, the tone shifted. Rodney, I'll be back Friday. I miss you and Lily so much. We miss you too. Lily keeps asking when Daddy's coming home. Deborah's stomach clenched. The timestamps matched the dates of his supposed business trips. She scrolled further, her dread mounting with every message. There were photos, Monica, the woman from the supermarket, smiling as she held their daughter, Lily. In one picture, Rodney stood behind them, his arms wrapped protectively around both. They looked like a family. She opened the gallery next. There were dozens of photos of Monica and Lily. At a park, in a house Deborah didn't recognize, on what looked like vacations. Her fingers hovered over a video, and despite her trembling hands, she clicked play. The video showed Rodney and Lily decorating a Christmas tree together, laughing as they argued over where to place the star. In the background, Monica's voice could be heard teasing them to hurry up. The magnitude of the betrayal hit Deborah like a physical blow. It wasn't just an affair. Rodney had a second life, a second family. She navigated back to his messages and checked the call logs. Monica's number appeared frequently, often during late-night hours when Rodney claimed to be working. She opened another messaging app and found more conversations with Monica, plans to meet, affectionate exchanges, even discussions about their finances. There were mentions of a house in another part of town, a home Deborah had never known existed. But the discoveries didn't end there. Deborah found another name, Renee, with a message thread that sent a chill through her. This one was less personal but still damning. Rodney and Renee were discussing a child named Sam, clearly his son. Deborah felt her breath catch as she realized the scope of Rodney's deceit might be even larger than she had imagined. Her vision blurred with tears, but she forced herself to keep looking. She needed to know the full extent of what she was dealing with. Every piece of evidence she uncovered felt like a stab to her heart, but she couldn't stop now. This wasn't just about her marriage. It was about the foundation of her entire life. When she finally set the phone down, Deborah's hands were shaking so badly she had to grip the edge of the counter to steady herself. Her thoughts raced. Rodney had constructed an elaborate web of lies, deceiving not just her but their children, and perhaps even Monica and Renee. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated, methodical. As she heard Rodney's car pull into the driveway, Deborah wiped her face and quickly placed the phone back where she had found it. She couldn't confront him yet. Not until she fully understood the scope of what he had done. Not until she had a plan. The door opened, and Rodney greeted her with the same warm smile he always wore. Deborah forced herself to respond in kind. But inside, something had shifted. The man standing before her was a stranger, and she was determined to uncover everything about the life he had been hiding. Chapter 4. Surveillance. The following weekend, Deborah put her plan into action. She had no intention of confronting Rodney without gathering more evidence. She needed to know just how far his deception extended. She decided to follow him. If he was maintaining another life, she wanted to see it with her own eyes. Rodney had told her he'd be working late Saturday, handling a client presentation in the city. Deborah played along, feigning understanding as she packed dinner for their children and made plans to stay in. But as soon as Rodney left the house, she grabbed her coat and car keys. Keeping a safe distance, she followed his car through the suburban streets, her pulse quickening as he merged onto the highway. He wasn't heading to the office. Instead, he drove to a neighborhood about 30 minutes away, an area Deborah recognized as being close to the supermarket where she had first seen him with Monica. Her suspicions were confirmed when Rodney turned into the driveway of a modest two-story house. He parked his car, retrieved a grocery bag from the trunk, and walked up to the front door. Deborah watched as the door opened and Monica greeted him with a smile. Lily darted out behind her, squealing, "Daddy!" Rodney scooped her up, laughing as he carried her inside. The door closed behind them, leaving Deborah alone in the darkened street. Her stomach churned as she sat in her car, trying to process the scene. She had expected it, but seeing it in person made the betrayal all the more real. It was one thing to read messages and see photos. It was another to witness her husband playing the role of father and partner in a home she had never known existed. Deborah waited, unsure of what to do next. After about an hour, the lights in the living room dimmed, and she saw Rodney and Monica in the kitchen through the window. They were cooking together, laughing and chatting with an ease that stung Deborah deeply. It was a stark contrast to the distance that had crept into their own marriage over the years. As the evening wore on, Deborah decided to push further. She parked her car a few houses down, careful to stay out of sight, and stepped out. The quiet suburban street amplified her every movement as she approached the house. She peeked through a side window, her heart pounding. Inside, she saw photos lining the walls, pictures of Rodney, Monica, and Lily at what looked like birthday parties and vacations. The sight was overwhelming, a grotesque confirmation of just how deeply Rodney had embedded himself in this second life. Deborah returned to her car, her hands trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. But her resolve had hardened. This wasn't the end of her search. It was just the beginning. She needed more proof, not only for her own clarity, but for the inevitable confrontation with Rodney. If she decided to divorce him, she would need evidence to protect herself and her children. The next day, Deborah hired a private investigator. She provided the details she had gathered, Monica's name, the address of the house, and the suspicious messages she had found. The investigator assured her they would follow up and uncover anything else Rodney might be hiding. While waiting for the investigator's report, Deborah decided to conduct her own surveillance. A few days later, Rodney left for another business trip. This time, Deborah followed him to the airport. She watched as he boarded a flight, not to the city he had mentioned, but to a small town in another state. Determined, she booked a ticket on the next available flight. When she arrived, Deborah rented a car and discreetly followed Rodney from the airport. He drove to a quaint neighborhood where he stopped at yet another house. To her astonishment, another woman opened the door, this one with a young boy by her side. Rodney embraced them both before stepping inside. Deborah's world spun. This wasn't just one secret family. There were two. Rodney was living an intricately constructed double, possibly triple life. It wasn't just infidelity. It was an entire network of lies and betrayals spanning cities and states. Deborah returned home exhausted, emotionally shattered but resolute. She wouldn't let Rodney continue this deception unchecked. Her trust in him was gone, replaced by a steely determination to expose the full extent of his deceit. As painful as the truth was, Deborah knew she had to see it through. The life she thought she had was already gone. Now, it was about reclaiming what she could and ensuring justice for herself and her children. Chapter 5. Confrontation. Deborah knew the moment had come to confront Rodney. Armed with the evidence gathered from his phone, her own surveillance, and the private investigator's findings, she was no longer afraid of the truth. The betrayal had already shattered her life. Now, it was about reclaiming control. It was a Friday evening, and Rodney had just returned home from another supposed business trip. Deborah sat waiting for him in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her calm demeanor belied the storm raging inside her. The children were staying with her sister for the weekend, a deliberate choice to ensure they wouldn't witness what was about to unfold. Rodney walked in, smiling as he dropped his bag by the door. "Hey, honey," he said, leaning in for a kiss. Deborah turned her head slightly, and his lips landed awkwardly on her cheek. He frowned, sensing something was wrong. "Everything okay?" "Sit down," Deborah said, her voice steady but cold. Rodney hesitated, studying her expression before complying. He sank into the armchair across from her, his posture slightly defensive. "What's this about?" he asked. Deborah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed a folder on the coffee table between them. Inside was the evidence she had gathered: printouts of messages, photos of him with Monica and Lily, in the investigator's report detailing his visits to the second woman and her son, Sam. She slid the folder toward him, watching his face as he opened it. The color drained from Rodney's face as he flipped through the pages. For a moment, he seemed frozen, his eyes darting across the incriminating documents. Then he looked up, his mouth opening as though to speak, but no words came out. "How long?" Deborah asked, her voice breaking the silence. "How long have you been lying to me?" Rodney set the folder down, running a hand through his hair. "Deborah, I can explain." "Don't," she interrupted, her voice sharper now. "Don't you dare insult me with excuses. I want the truth, Rodney, the whole truth." Rodney sighed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "It started a few years ago," he admitted quietly, "with Monica. I didn't mean for it to happen, but things between us just clicked. And then Lily came along and what?" Deborah cut in. "You decided to build a second family while still pretending to be a devoted husband to me? Or was that just the start? Did Renee and Sam come later?" Rodney's head snapped up, his eyes widening. "You know about them too?" Deborah felt a sickening mix of vindication and heartbreak. "Of course I do," she said. "How could you think I wouldn't find out? How could you think you could keep this up forever?" "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Rodney said, his voice desperate. "I was trying to keep everything balanced, to make sure no one got hurt." "No one got hurt?" Deborah's voice rose, trembling with anger. "Do you even hear yourself? You've been lying to me, to our children, to everyone. For years, you built entire lives with other women while making me believe we had a stable marriage. How is that not hurting anyone?" Rodney's shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "I never wanted to lose you." Deborah laughed bitterly. "You lost me the moment you decided to live a lie. Do you have any idea what you've done? To me? To our family? To those other women and children who probably think they're your only priority?" Rodney had no response. He looked down at his hands, silent and defeated. Deborah took a deep breath, willing herself to stay composed. "Here's what's going to happen," she said firmly. "I'm filing for divorce. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I have more than enough evidence to ensure that I and our children get what we're entitled to. You can explain your actions to the court." Rodney's head snapped up. "Deborah, please." "It's over, Rodney," she said, cutting him off. You made your choices. Now, you'll face the consequences. Without waiting for a reply, Deborah stood and walked out of the room, leaving Rodney alone with the weight of his actions. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead would be difficult, but it would be hers to navigate, and she wouldn't allow Rodney to dictate her life any longer. Chapter 6. Second Discovery. The days following Deborah's confrontation with Rodney were a whirlwind of emotional turmoil and legal preparations. Despite his promises to make things right, Deborah knew there was no going back. She had given him years of trust, only to discover he had been living multiple lives behind her back. Her lawyer, a sharp and empathetic woman named Cynthia, helped Deborah gather the necessary documentation for the divorce proceedings. As they combed through Rodney's financial records, Cynthia discovered something alarming: unexplained withdrawals and payments that didn't align with their household expenses. It appeared Rodney had been funneling money to accounts and properties Deborah hadn't known existed. I think you should prepare yourself, Cynthia said during one meeting. This might be bigger than what we've uncovered so far. Deborah braced herself as the investigation deepened. The private investigator provided additional information. Rodney wasn't just maintaining homes for Monica and Renee. He also had ties to a third woman, a single mother named Vanessa, who lived in yet another state. Vanessa had an 8-year-old son, Max, whom Rodney had been financially supporting for years. The scale of Rodney's betrayal was staggering. 3 women, 3 children, 3 separate lives, all intricately woven together with careful lies and half-truths. Deborah felt as though she was unraveling a puzzle with no end, each piece revealing a deeper layer of deception. Vanessa, like Monica and Renee, believed Rodney was a dedicated partner. The investigator discovered emails and photos that painted a chillingly familiar picture. Family outings, holidays, and even affectionate messages where Rodney promised Vanessa a future together. It became clear that Rodney had perfected the art of leading multiple lives, dividing his time and resources with meticulous precision. Deborah's anger burned anew as she reviewed the evidence. How had he managed this for so long? The emotional toll on her and their children was devastating, but the financial implications were just as serious. Rodney's earnings, once assumed to support their household, had been stretched across 3 families. The strain on their finances became glaringly apparent as Deborah realized how much of their savings had been siphoned away. Cynthia filed subpoenas to access Rodney's hidden accounts and secure a complete financial picture. The findings were shocking: multiple properties, secret savings accounts, and even credit cards in Rodney's name that Deborah had never seen. He had been careful, but not careful enough. Armed with this new information, Deborah's resolve strengthened. She contacted Monica and Renee anonymously, sending them copies of the evidence she had collected. The reactions were swift and predictable. Both women were horrified to learn of Rodney's other lives. Vanessa was harder to reach, but Deborah made sure she too received the truth. Rodney's perfect web began to collapse. Monica demanded answers, confronting him at the house Deborah had once seen through her surveillance. Renee, too, cut ties, threatening to take legal action against him. And Vanessa, though devastated, reached out to Deborah directly, seeking advice on how to protect herself and her son from Rodney's manipulations. For Deborah, the pain of betrayal was compounded by the realization that these women and children were victims too. They had trusted Rodney, just as she had, and now their lives were left in ruins. But Deborah refused to let his deceit define her future. She was determined to rebuild, to create a life free of lies and manipulation. The legal battle ahead would be fierce, but Deborah had the evidence, the support, and most importantly, the clarity she needed to move forward. Rodney's secrets had been exposed, and the consequences of his actions were finally catching up to him. Chapter 7. The Battle for the Truth. The courtroom was a stark contrast to the chaos that had engulfed Deborah's life. It was orderly, sterile, and governed by procedure, qualities she desperately craved as she fought to regain control over her future. The divorce proceedings were not just a legal battle. They were an emotional reckoning, a confrontation of everything Rodney had hidden for years. Deborah's lawyer, Cynthia, was relentless. She presented the mountain of evidence Deborah had gathered: the financial records, the private investigators' reports, the photos and messages that laid bare Rodney's triple life. The judge's face betrayed no emotion, but Deborah could feel the gravity of the situation settling over the courtroom. Rodney's defense was weak at best. His lawyer attempted to paint the picture of a man overwhelmed by the pressures of family and work, but the evidence of his deliberate, calculated actions was undeniable. The financial documentation alone painted a damning picture. Rodney had drained significant portions of their savings to support his other families, leaving Deborah and their children with far less than they deserved. Deborah's testimony was calm and clear. She spoke about the trust she had placed in Rodney, the life they had built together, and the devastation of discovering his betrayals. She didn't cry. She had shed enough tears in private. In the courtroom, she was determined to present herself as strong, focused, and unshakable. Monica, Renee, and Vanessa were also called to testify. Their stories were hauntingly similar. Promises of love, secretive behaviors, and financial support that always seemed to come with an undercurrent of dishonesty. They each described the moment they discovered Rodney's deception, their shock and heartbreak mirroring Deborah's own experience. The collective weight of their testimonies was overwhelming, painting Rodney as a man who had masterfully manipulated everyone in his orbit. The judge took particular interest in the impact Rodney's actions had on the children involved. Deborah's lawyer emphasized how Rodney's financial decisions had jeopardized the well-being of their two children, pointing out the ways he had prioritized his other families over his legal and moral obligations to them. The court documents also revealed that Rodney had failed to disclose several assets during the divorce filings, a fact that did not go unnoticed by the judge. As the proceedings continued, Rodney's once confident demeanor crumbled. He seemed smaller, more subdued, as the extent of his actions was laid bare. His attempts to apologize privately to Deborah had been met with cold indifference. She didn't want apologies, she wanted justice. The judge's ruling was unequivocal. Deborah was granted primary custody of their children, ensuring their stability and shielding them from the chaos Rodney had caused. She was also awarded a significant portion of Rodney's assets, including the family home, to provide for their future. The court ordered Rodney to pay substantial child support and alimony, with strict penalties for non-compliance. Beyond the financial repercussions, the judge admonished Rodney for his actions, citing the harm he had caused to multiple families. It was a rare moment of personal accountability in a legal setting, and Deborah felt a small sense of vindication as she listened to the judge's words. When the proceedings concluded, Deborah walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. The fight had been exhausting, but it was worth it. Rodney's web of lies had unraveled in the most public way possible, and Deborah had secured the resources she needed to rebuild her life and protect her children. As she stepped into the crisp air outside the courthouse, Deborah felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time in years, it was hers to navigate. Rodney's influence over her life had ended, and she was determined never to let anyone take her trust for granted again. Chapter 8: A New Life. The weeks following the divorce proceedings were a mixture of relief and adjustment for Deborah. The legal battle was over, but the process of rebuilding her life was just beginning. Her world, once anchored by the illusion of stability with Rodney, now felt uncharted and uncertain. But for the first time in years, she was in control. Deborah moved back into the family home with her children, determined to create a safe and loving environment for them. The house, once a symbol of her shattered marriage, became a blank canvas for her new life. She redecorated, repainting walls, rearranging furniture, and replacing reminders of Rodney with things that felt uniquely hers. Each change was a small but powerful step toward reclaiming her space. Her children, though young, had felt the impact of the upheaval. Deborah worked hard to maintain a sense of normalcy for them. She spent more time with them, helping with homework, attending school events, and creating new traditions that were just for the three of them. She sought out a family therapist to ensure they had the support they needed to process the changes. Slowly, she saw their smiles return, their laughter filling the house again. Financially, things were more stable than Deborah had feared. With the court-ordered support and her own steady job, she could manage their expenses without the constant worry that had plagued her during the discovery of Rodney's betrayals. Deborah also took steps to educate herself about managing finances, something Rodney had largely controlled during their marriage. She opened new accounts, set up a budget, and began saving for the future. Her relationship with the other women involved, Monica, Renee, and Vanessa, had shifted over time. What began as mutual pain and anger had grown into an unlikely camaraderie. They were united by their shared experiences and a determination to move forward. Deborah kept in touch with them, exchanging updates and offering support when needed. Their children, too, became a reminder of the innocent lives caught in the crossfire of Rodney's deceit. Deborah also started to focus on herself for the first time in years. She took up yoga, something she had always wanted to try but had never made time for. She joined a book club and began volunteering at a local shelter, activities that brought her a sense of fulfillment and connection. Gradually, the weight of betrayal lifted, replaced by a growing sense of self-worth. Rodney, meanwhile, had retreated from public view. His relationships with Monica, Renee, and Vanessa had disintegrated, leaving him isolated. Deborah heard through mutual acquaintances that he was struggling to keep up with his financial obligations and facing the consequences of his actions. She felt no joy in his downfall, but neither did she feel pity. He had made his choices, and now he was living with them. One evening, as Deborah sat on the porch watching her children play in the yard, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it no longer frightened her. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and upheaval, and she had come out stronger. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was enough. For Deborah, the greatest victory wasn't in the courtroom or the financial settlement. It was in rediscovering herself, finding strength in the face of adversity, and reclaiming her sense of purpose. She was no longer defined by the lies of the past, but by the resilience she had found within herself. Chapter 9. Restoration. The passage of time brought healing, though it wasn't always linear. Some days, Deborah felt a strong sense of empowerment, ready to take on the world. Other days, the memories of Rodney's betrayal would resurface, bringing with them a wave of pain and anger. But as the months turned into years, the emotional wounds began to fade, replaced by a sense of resilience and renewal. Deborah's focus remained on her children, Emma and Jack, who had adapted remarkably well to their new normal. The family therapy sessions had been instrumental in helping them process the changes in their lives. Emma, who was 10, had initially struggled with feelings of confusion and anger toward her father. Jack, at 8, had been quieter, internalizing his emotions. But through therapy and Deborah's unwavering support, both children began to find their footing again. Deborah made a point to foster open communication with them, encouraging questions and honest conversations. She never badmouthed Rodney in front of them, despite her lingering resentment. Instead, she emphasized that their father's mistakes didn't diminish his love for them. It was a delicate balance, but one she was determined to maintain for their sake. As her children thrived, so did Deborah. She earned a promotion at work, her dedication and newfound confidence shining through in everything she did. The financial stability allowed her to provide new opportunities for Emma and Jack, from extracurricular activities to family trips that created lasting memories. They explored national parks, took up hiking, and even adopted a rescue dog, a playful golden retriever named Max, who brought endless joy to their home. The house had transformed too. Deborah's touch was everywhere: bright, warm colors, family photos, and mementos from their adventures. The lingering shadows of Rodney's betrayal were replaced by a vibrant, inviting atmosphere. The home felt like a sanctuary, a place where Deborah and her children could heal and grow together. Over time, Deborah found herself reconnecting with old friends and making new ones. A neighbor, Linda, became a close confidant, offering support and encouragement during Deborah's most difficult days. Through Linda, she also joined a local support group for women who had experienced infidelity and betrayal. Hearing their stories and sharing her own helped Deborah realize she wasn't alone. The group became a source of strength, a reminder that resilience was a shared journey. Romantic relationships were not a priority for Deborah, though she occasionally considered the idea of dating again. Her focus was on herself and her children, but she also understood that her past didn't have to define her future. She had rebuilt her life on her terms, and when the time was right, she was open to the possibility of love, this time, on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. One pivotal moment came when Deborah received a letter from Rodney. It wasn't an attempt at reconciliation, but rather an acknowledgement of his actions and their consequences. In the letter, he apologized for the pain he had caused and expressed regret for the choices that had led to their separation. He admitted that he was struggling to rebuild his own life, but understood that he was solely responsible for his downfall. Deborah read the letter carefully, feeling a mix of emotions. It didn't erase the past or heal the wounds, but it was a small step toward closure. She chose not to respond, feeling no obligation to re-engage with him. The letter was for him, not for her, and she was at peace with letting it go. As the anniversary of her divorce approached, Deborah reflected on how far she had come. The pain of the past had been replaced by a quiet strength and a profound appreciation for the life she had built. She had restored her sense of self, her faith in her ability to overcome adversity, and most importantly, her bond with her children. Deborah had learned that restoration wasn't about returning to what was but about creating something new, something stronger, wiser, and more authentic. Her journey was far from over, but she faced the future with a sense of hope and determination that had once seemed impossible. Chapter 10. Finding Freedom. Several years had passed since the day Deborah's world fell apart in the fruit section of a supermarket. Looking back, she could hardly recognize the person she had been. A woman whose life seemed so secure, yet was quietly crumbling beneath her feet. The journey since then had been long and difficult, but as Deborah sat on her front porch watching the sun set over her neighborhood, she felt a sense of peace that had been absent for years. Her children, Emma and Jack, had grown into resilient, compassionate teenagers. Emma, now 13, had developed a passion for art, her sketches often adorning the walls of their home. Jack, at 11, excelled in science and loved tinkering with gadgets. They were thriving, and Deborah was proud of the stability and love she had worked so hard to provide for them. The home they shared had become a symbol of their new life, filled with laughter, new traditions, and an openness that had been missing before. They had grown closer as a family, bonded by those shared experiences and the determination to move forward. Max, their golden retriever, remained a constant source of joy, his playful antics a reminder of life's simple pleasures. Deborah herself had found a new rhythm. She continued to excel in her career, recently accepting a leadership position that allowed her to mentor younger colleagues. Her financial independence and professional achievements gave her a sense of empowerment she had never known during her marriage. She had also deepened her involvement in her community, volunteering with organizations that supported women and families recovering from betrayal and hardship. Though she had hesitated at first, Deborah eventually dipped her toes back into the world of dating. It was a slow process, one that required her to confront lingering fears and rebuild her trust in others. She had no intention of rushing into anything serious, but over time, she met someone who reminded her of the kind of partnership she deserved. His name was Mark, a widower with a gentle demeanor and a love for the outdoors. Their relationship was grounded in honesty, mutual respect, and a shared appreciation for the lessons life had taught them. Still, Deborah's happiness wasn't dependent on any single relationship. The greatest transformation had come from within. She had learned to trust herself again, to listen to her instincts and honor her boundaries. She had let go of the guilt and self-blame that once haunted her, recognizing that Rodney's actions were a reflection of his choices, not her worth. The past remained a part of her, but it no longer defined her. Deborah had found a way to integrate those painful experiences into her story without letting them control her future. She had even begun journaling, documenting her journey not only as a form of reflection, but also as a way to inspire others. Her writing was raw and honest, capturing the highs and lows of reclaiming her life. Eventually, she shared her story in the support group that had helped her so much, finding fulfillment in helping others navigate their own struggles. On the anniversary of her divorce, Deborah marked the day not with sadness, but with celebration. She took Emma and Jack on a weekend getaway to the mountains, where they hiked, roasted marshmallows by the fire, and laughed until their sides hurt. It was a reminder of how far they had come as a family, and of the limitless possibilities that lay ahead. As she sat by the fire that evening, Deborah looked up at the stars and felt a deep sense of gratitude. She was grateful for her children, for the strength she had discovered within herself, and for the freedom she had fought so hard to claim. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was authentic, and it was hers. In that moment, Deborah realized that freedom wasn't just about escaping the chains of betrayal. It was about embracing the courage to rebuild, to love, and to trust again. It was about knowing that, no matter what life brought, she had the strength to overcome it. And for Deborah, that was enough.